good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the globe. Welcome to the Tree Fund webinar series. We will be getting started here in about 2 minutes. As most of you know who've joined the Tree Fund webinar series in the past, it's our tradition to find the chat box and let us know where you're coming from around the world. We love to see it. And there we go, our first person. Welcome, Logan from Columbus, Ohio. Paul, just around the corner from you. Welcome, Miami. Welcome, Hong Kong. Boy, you're coming in fast. Welcome, Quebec. Iowa. My gosh, I can't read them. They're coming in so fast. We have a big webinar today. There's over 1,600 people registered. Thank you all for being here. Welcome, Miami, California, more Quebec. Some Canadians, Winnipeg. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We will start the webinar here in about 2 minutes. As you join us, box and let us know where you're coming from. Just a little tradition. I think we started a number of years ago. Welcome, Mexico. I had the opportunity to be at the Latin American Congress on arboriculture down in Colombia earlier this month. It was wonderful. Wonderful conference down there. Welcome, Italy. Welcome, Singapore. Montreal. Well, Heath, if we'll hit that record button, we'll go ahead and start today's webinar series. So I know some of you are still joining in. Welcome to the Tree Fund webinar series. My name is Bo Broadbeck. I work with Auburn University Extension, and we have the pleasure of being the host of the Tree Fund webinar series. It's a wonderful webinar series that we started a number of years ago with the opportunity to share some of the new research that is being funded by Tree Fund, and getting this research in your hands, the practitioners from around the world, to be able to hopefully use this information, add it to your toolboxes as you are practicing arboriculture and urban forestry. It is truly a pleasure to have everybody on. I think this is our last webinar of 2024. I was glad to see that we had over 1,600 people registered. So I think we're finishing off with a big bang. I want to really thank the Tree Fund staff, Heath Hupke and Paul Putnam, who really do a wonderful job promoting this, around the country, around the United States. I know I had the chance to promote it when I was down in Colombia a few weeks ago. So thank you all for being here and closing out the Tree Fund webinar series for 2024. I know Heath Hupke with Tree Fund has a great series of webinars with us for 2025 already lined up. He's going to tell you a little bit about that. As you look at us today, we got a few extra faces on here. We have 2 presenters, which will be introduced in a little bit. We also have with us David Gordon, who we just elected to be our chair-elect to the Board of Trustees to Tree Fund, and so he's going to be introducing today's speaker. And we also have Paul Putnam on today, who is the CEO of Tree Fund. So we have a little bit of fun in store for y'all before we get the webinar series. But thank you all for being here, and I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Paul Putnam.
Great. Thanks so much, Bo. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome again to today's webinar hosted by the Tree Research and Education Endowment Fund, also known as Tree Fund. And a big thank you to our Crown and Platinum partners that you saw on that first slide. We're really thrilled to see such a diverse group of arborists, researchers, and tree care business owners joining us from around the world. As a reminder, at the Tree Fund, we're really committed to advancing research, education, and awareness surrounding the importance of trees in our communities. Before we begin today's seminar, we wanted to take just a few minutes talking about the Tree Fund itself. Some of you may not know that we are a nonprofit, also known as a non-governmental agency, which means that our budget is not supported by the US government on a regular basis. We depend upon the support of our corporate sponsors and individual donors to keep this organization going. We understand that other organizations charge a fee for their webinars, which then helps those organizations manage their costs. The Tree Fund Board of Directors, which oversees this organization, is committed to keeping these webinars free and open to everyone. In order to do that, we need your support. You can support us by attending these webinars, telling your friends and colleagues about them, and also following us on social media. And we also need your financial support. You don't have to be a millionaire to support Tree Fund. If these webinars are meaningful to you, if you value the research being funded to bring you cutting-edge information on safety, urban tree care, arboriculture, we're asking you today to join us as a Tree Fund donor. And we're not asking you to do anything that we aren't doing ourselves. So during this webinar, if you're able, we're asking that you donate just $25 to keep Tree Fund going during 2025. We're hoping to have 20 new donors for Tree Fund today. And for every new $25 or greater donor who gives today, this is for up to 20 new donors, I will personally match your donation $25 up to $500. So this means that if you give $25, I will match that personally. So it's like your donation is actually $50. Over the past few years, we've had thousands of participants like you. If everyone who tunes into our webinars donated just a few dollars, we'd be able to expand our reach and maybe even add a new grant program. So think about how many webinars you've personally attended this year. What have they been worth to you? Has it been worth $5, $25? You can support the work of Tree Fund through the QR code that you see on your screen or by clicking on the link in the chat. Thank you so much for your consideration and support. At this time, I'm now pleased to introduce our Grants and Development Manager, Heath Hupke.
Well, thank you. And again, as we've said, we find that these webinar series are very important for you and our research and really our overall mission of disseminating, getting this information out and continuously building it. So we thank you for your support in being here today. And we thank you for any financial support that you're able to help with us. And I do want to, part of my role as a grants and development manager is to put together this webinar series, and we're looking very much forward to this coming year. We have just already in the first few months some great opportunities lined up. You will see those registration links, a little more information coming down the pipeline. And for those that have attended recently, again, your ISA information, your CEU information has already been gathered when you did your registration. So do not feel like you need to put that in chat. Keep that chat open for great conversations for awareness. And if you have questions today, we do have a Q&A function and our question Zoom links. But for those that did attend the November webinar, those were approved about 1 week ago. So you should see your ISA CEU credits from the November webinar there. If you have not received it, please send an email to education@treefund.org. I'll put that link in the chat function here in a little bit. Or if you have a need for a certificate of attendance today, please email that link as well. So I am very happy and excited to introduce David Gordon, who as you had maybe heard earlier, is a board of trustees member for Tree Fund. He's also the vice chair currently and will be the chair-elect and will be serving as a great leadership role. David is a landscape architect, like many of you attending today. He is from Indianapolis, Indiana, has been there for the past 35 years, and in 2018, he was named a fellow of ASLA. So thank you, David, for helping us today.
Thank you, Heath. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Holly Campbell and Dr. Rebecca Abney, both with the University of Georgia Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. The research they will be presenting was funded by a grant from the Tree Fund's Tree and Soil Research Fund, which supports research focusing on trees and soil that would be of particular interest to landscape architects. And as you've heard, that's me. And hopefully there are a number of other landscape architects viewing today. But we're happy to have all of you joining us. Holly Campbell received an MS in Forest Resources with an emphasis on forest soils from the University of Georgia and is an ISA certified arborist. Her current position includes academic instruction and professional and public education in community forestry, arboriculture, dendrology, and community wildfire preparedness. She also participates in limited research projects investigating urban tree benefits, tree stress, and soil quality and health. Dr. Abney conducted her PhD in soil biogeochemistry at the University of California, Merced, studying the interactive effects of erosion and wildfire on soil organic matter. In her current position at the University of Georgia, she has continued her assessment of the role of prescribed fires in the Southeast on forest soils, as well as seeking to understand the full potential of the use of biochar in urban soils. Holly and Rebecca, thank you for being with us today and sharing your research. I will turn it over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some research that Holly and I have undertaken that was supported by the Tree Fund, looking at the potential for the use of biochar to improve urban tree health, urban soils, and then urban wastewater or stormwater quality. And I just wanted to start off with some brief acknowledgements of our collaborators, Dan Markowitz and Jay Shelton, and graduate students that did a lot of work in this project, Alexis Martin, who graduated 2 years ago, and Courtney Scott, who's a current PhD student in my lab. And this work was also supported by the Society of American Foresters and the city of Brookhaven, which is located outside of Atlanta, Georgia. So what we're going to talk about today is just some overview of the specific challenges that urban soils have and how that can be a really challenging environment for trees. And then what is biochar and how it can be used to improve urban soils and its potential to be used as a management tool. And then our results from the study that Tree Fund supported. And then Holly and I have written an outreach publication that's now available on the Warnell website, and it has a lot of management recommendations for using biochar to support urban tree growth and stormwater quality. So to jump right in, urban soils have a really big range in qualities. They can be like this picture on the left where they look pretty much like the native soil. They haven't been extensively disturbed. And if you go to a lot of like urban development sites where there is excavation, you can get to see really cool views of soil profiles that otherwise are pretty challenging to get to see. And that's like one end of the spectrum. On the other end, they can be pretty terrible soils that are mostly debris. They can be very contaminated with concrete, pesticides, and other pollutants that make them a really challenging environment for trees to grow in. Another like big challenge is changes to soil drainage and like the size of the volume that a tree's roots have to grow in. So they might have either too little drainage or too much drainage, and it really just depends on the individual site. So this is a classic parking lot tree that you might find in the Southeast where there's a planter. The soil is maybe 4 to 10 inches deep, and there's a lot of mulch, and there's also a lot of competing vegetation. And these tend to act sort of like teacups where when it rains or if they're irrigated, the water pools up and there's not free drainage underneath the tree. So they become saturated, but they also can experience extreme dry periods if it's not irrigated. If there's a long period of time without precipitation, then these trees are experiencing real extremes in soil moisture conditions. And a lot of this depends on site design. A lot of these are installed where the whole lot would be compacted before installing the tree planter, and there's some like new designs where folks are doing compaction around where the tree vaults will be, so there is tree drainage. So there's like options for that, but this is an environment where it's very stressful for a tree to grow in. And even like within an urban environment, there's a big diversity in like what these like challenges would look like. So in this picture on the right is another parking lot tree. These are all on the campus of University of Georgia, little red maples that are a little stressed. So this tree on the very far right is in a pretty small planting space, but it gets a ton of mulch, doesn't get irrigation, but it really experiences a high heat load particularly in the summer, which drives a lot of evaporation. So that tree is in a really stressful environment. There's these trees in the middle picture where they're in of the design choice for this like patio where we have an eating area on campus. The trees are in these small restricted volume spaces where the bushes in the back have a much bigger planting volume. And so that can be like a challenge where we're trying to put trees in spaces that are just hard for them to exist in. That's probably a hotter soil environment than over in this bigger soil area because there's concrete on top of the soil that can absorb more heat. And then this picture on the far left, there's like 3 red maples planted together and they're doing okay. They're a little restricted on their soil volume and they're a little bit shading each other out. But that's they're on a slope. They don't get a lot of infiltration water. And what precipitation does fall on that soil is like really runs off pretty quickly. So they don't get as much infiltration as they might like. So all these trees are facing similar but different layers of challenges to growing in the urban environment. And one solution we have to this is to use tree vaults. And the idea of a tree vault is to give the tree space to grow in a spot where we otherwise have impervious surfaces. And these take on so many different forms and functions. And when I'm traveling, I love to take pictures of these. So here's some that we have in Athens, these actually just got removed, but this is a big tree vault. And what's challenging about this one is there's not a lot of area for infiltration from the stormwater runoff. So it's only what falls on the vault is pretty much the water that tree gets. It used to get irrigation and it didn't for a while. Here's one at a parking lot. That's sort of like what I showed a couple slides ago. And these in Salt Lake City, took a picture of them because they also have this feature of a little curve around the tree where the water, even like water running along the sidewalk, can't be infiltrated into the tree soil that it does have. So that's a challenge. And then this picture on the right is in Charleston, South Carolina, where they basically just paved around the tree, and you can see where the roots are in conflict with the sidewalk and causing buckling. That's been repaired several times. So that's a pretty big expense for some urban managers. So there's a big diversity in how these can look. And there's a kind of classic model where you would build an urban tree vault where the tree has some soil space underground. There might be some protected areas where there's either a grate on top of the soil where folks can't walk, or they can walk, but they won't be walking directly on the soil surface. That mitigates some compaction. This is the schematic from Cornell and their recommendations for how to install a tree vault. And it allows for urban environments to enjoy the benefits of trees like shade and reduced temperatures, better water management, but it really is a challenging environment for trees to live in. And these are also promoted as a mechanism to improve stormwater quality and quantity. So by having soils and trees in our sidewalks, they slow down the flow of water in major storm events, and the soils can do some filtration of the water and improve the actual quality of it. So our urban watersheds can have slightly cleaner water is one of the aims that we have for these. So where does biochar fit into this? Well, biochar, what it is the product of pyrolysis, which is low or no oxygen in burning environments. And it's typically made from natural byproducts. So it could be woody material, just like wood or bark, branches, or like agricultural byproducts, pistachio hulls, almond hulls, corn husks, things like this, that when they're waste products, it becomes a really efficient way to use our resources that we're not otherwise using. And if we zoom in like on a chemical level, it's essentially is charcoal. And so it's formed of condensed aromatic rings with attached like functional groups. And depending on how it's formed, this chemistry will differ a little bit. And it's become a really popular soil amendment, and that you can now buy commercially pretty much anywhere at your local farm store, Lowe's, Home Depot, or even on Amazon. I've seen it. So the idea for biochar actually originated, it was inspired by the terra preta soils, which can be found in the Amazon. And these were formed when indigenous folks who live there would amend their soils with charcoal and ash from campfires, but also like manure and pottery and food waste. And these soils have been found to be really productive and way more highly productive than soils adjacent to them that weren't amended. And this has been inspiring because it's been a long time since indigenous folks, several centuries since they were cultivating these soils for agricultural purposes, but they're still like highly productive. So this has like inspired this. And here's a picture from my colleague Daniel Markowitz, who's also here at University of Georgia, has done some work on these soils. These are in Brazil. And then here's like a zoomed in picture. You can see this top part is what's been amended. Takes on this black color that's from the charcoal, and you can see it's got really good aggregation. You can see a happy little root growing in the middle of that. It tends to be a good way to improve soil fertility. And the bottom of this is the native soil type that they have there. So you can tell by the color alone that it's a lot less fertile. So what are the actual effects of biochar as a soil amendment? And these definitely depend on the actual biochar that you have. So how it was made, what it was made from, and its properties. But in general, it is known to increase soil pH. It tends to have a high pH itself. It can also increase the cation exchange capacity. There's a lot of exchange sites in the chemical structure of biochar that allow it to exchange cations. It has a pretty low density. If you've ever held ash or charcoal in your hand, you know it's very lightweight. So it can decrease the density of soil, which can help maybe with compaction and improve like porosity, which I've done on the bottom, and that can improve water flow into soils, infiltration, and also like water retention. And then of course, biochar is actually mostly carbon, depending on how it's made, it's 50 to 90% carbon. So it's really been looked at as a way to increase soil carbon concentrations and potential for carbon sequestration. So there's been a lot of excitement about using this to potentially mitigate ongoing climate change by increasing soil carbon stocks. And part of this is because biochar takes a relatively long time to break down in soil compared to other components of soil organic matter. So when we looked at the terra preta soils, it's been several hundred years and there's still charcoal existing in those soils. That's the biochar. And so that can be a way that we can really increase our soil carbon stocks for the long time scale. And then overall, all these kind of act together to improve general soil health, which is a main goal of managing our soils. So for this study, we had a couple of research questions. First, we wanted to look at how different strategies of planting trees with biochar in the vault setting would improve the soil quality, the outflow water quality, and tree growth. And so we did 2 consecutive greenhouse studies, and I'm only going to talk about one today. But this is just looking at the different ways of planting trees with biochar, how to apply it, how much to apply, and how that affected tree growth and soil quality and outflow water quality. So we have 5 different treatments that we tried, and these are just imagining if you have a tree in a vault, what does it look like? So you might imagine a 1% by weight of biochar at the bottom of a pot, 1% mixed in homogeneously with the soil, 1% applied at the top of the pot that would just tilt in just an inch or so, 5% mixed in homogeneously, and then a control which had no biochar. And these were trees we planted willow oaks and red maples, 10 of each in each treatment. So we had 100 trees total. And they're in the 3-gallon black pots, which is to simulate sort of a really high stress environment. So our urban trees are in relatively small spaces and they can be really hot, particularly here in Georgia. So this was a pretty good representation of what it's like to be a tree in a really hot parking lot in Georgia. And so we planted these in the spring and then monitored them growing throughout a growing season through the summer. And just to like step back for a minute and like, where did we get our biochar from? It's from a local wood ash source that we collected that was donated from a local timber company. And we did just a little bit of a deep dive into like the chemical properties of this wood ash, and we sieved it into what we're calling a biochar fraction. So we didn't buy biochar directly, but you could do that. But just as like another way to look at biochar is it's like the big fraction, the big high carbon fraction in ash. It could be a byproduct of just burning wood. So we have an unsieved, this is basically ash is here at the top, and then it goes increasingly bigger biochar fractions, so greater than 250 microns in size, greater than 1 millimeter in size, and greater than 2 millimeter in size. We measured a number of properties. I want to highlight that the pH actually decreases once you remove a lot of the ash components. And when you burn wood and you make ash, you end up with a lot of components that can raise your pH. And ash is widely used as a liming substance in agricultural and forestry settings. So we didn't really want to change our pH with this study, but we have used this in previous ones, then it can be an effective liming agent. And we ended up using the greater than 250 micron size class. So it had a pH of 10.8, a cation exchange capacity of 10.3, which is a little bit higher than our native soils here in Georgia. But if you can imagine how you might pick a biochar that had a higher or lower CEC, depending on like what your soil goals were. It had a relatively high concentration of calcium and phosphorus as well. And they all have a pretty high surface area. So there's a lot of spaces in the actual biochar itself for chemistry to happen. That's what that tells us. So we planted the trees in spring of 2022, and we monitored their growth during the summer growing season. So here are trees in pots. Each of our tables are little blocks with all of our treatments. And throughout this experiment, we did a number of what we call through flow experiments to measure outflow, water quality, and quantity. So with these experiments, we added a liter of water to each pot and timed it for 1 hour, and then collected the water that went through the pot and measured how much volume there was and the pH and electrical conductivity of the water coming through these. And the pH and electrical conductivity are an indicator of the chemistry that's going on within the pot. So how does the biochar interact with the soil and the trees? And I'm going to jump a little bit into the data here. So in this little cartoons that you're going to see, several of these figures, we have the date here on the x-axis, and then right here we've got through flow volume, and then we have all these treatment categories. So 1% at the bottom is red, the orange is 1%, oh gosh, at the top. Pink is our control, and sorry, these got a little jungled. The blue is a 5% mixed in. And so with the through flow volume, this is how much water is at the bottom of the pot, how much has gone through. So actually the lower number is more water retention. So we had the most water go through with our controls, and 1% at the bottom. So adding the biochar at the bottom of a tree vault or without adding it, we had more water moving through our pots or simulated tree vaults. But when we had the 5% mix, or the 1% at the top, was where we actually had the most water retention. So if you're working to like slow down your stormwater flows, adding the biochar at the top or mixing it in could be a good strategy to slowing down your stormwater. And then through these same kind of experiments, we have pH here and then our summer months going on. So with the pH, we had the highest pH coming through, where we have 1% at the top, and the control is down here, which had like the lowest pH, and the pH trends upward over time. And this is because our input water, so our native soil pH would have been a bit lower, but our well water that we were irrigating with had a pH of 7.5, and that really increased the pH of the through flow water over time, which makes sense. And then with electrical conductivity, this is our 5% mix here, so it was the highest there. The actual biochar that we had was just a little bit salty, but as that got washed through the soil, that went down over time. And these electrical conductivity values, which is an indicator for salts in our soil, are not of a level that we were concerned about that hurting the trees at all. It just was important to note that like the first flush of biochar, if there's anything on it, it might get moved out into the soil water solution and into your stormwater if it's in a tree vault. Okay, and we measured tree growth. We have red maples and willow oaks that we grew throughout the summer. And here I'm showing you the caliper data. And so on the left is red maples and the right is willow oaks. And just to talk about the willow oaks, they actually got a little bit damaged before they arrived with us, which was unfortunate. But they did the best when they had the highest level of biochar control. They really struggled with the soils being pretty dry and it being really hot. So they needed all the help they could get. And they actually, you can see the growth declined down in August. They pretty much were all dead by the end of the study, unfortunately. But for our red maples, they did okay. They weren't damaged when they arrived to us, and we saw like significant improvements in their growth with the 5% mix of biochar, but also 1% of biochar added at the top as like a mulch. And this really shows that one, maybe you need a higher dose of biochar to get a bigger effect, but also like you can add biochar at the top. So maybe after the tree is planted, you could add biochar and still possibly see effect. And this shows that it also needed, like it really was struggling with water, and adding the biochar at the surface reduced some of the evaporation of water from the soil surface. So that was like really where they were struggling. So we did monitor tree mortality, and you can see the willow, this is at the end of the study. The willow oaks are here in the green, and the survival was very low, and it wasn't really consistent across the treatments, like who was doing, which treatment was doing better than the others. They were all pretty equally bad. But for the red maples, they actually, there were some differences in survival. So the 1% at the top, 1% mix, and 5% mix were all about equal statistically in terms of survival. And they did better than a control or 1% of biochar added at the bottom, which shows that like that's really a reflection of the effect of biochar on the water status of the soil itself. So at the end of the study, we destructively sampled the soils and the trees and looked at differences in them. And so I'm going to show you a couple of graphs right here. So we have our different treatments here at the bottom, 1% mixed in, 1% bottom, 1% top, 5% mixed. We have a control, which is our treatment where we didn't add biochar, but this was collected at the end of the study. And I also have the pre-experiment soil types. So just want to demonstrate that like the soil pH actually increased with the use of our well water. So the source of your water can change the chemistry, something to think about, the chemistry of your soil and the environment where your trees are going, and actually went up by about like a third of a pH unit, which is significant from the perspective of a tree. This was over the course of about 6 months, so actually not a very long time scale. And then for the rest of the pH, there was a significant increase from the other treatments with the 5% mix, which makes sense because this is a much higher dose than 1% anywhere. And all of these samples were taken and homogenized, so it's a representative 1%. It doesn't really matter where you add it if you're analyzing the soil in bulk. So those were all the same, but the 5% had a higher pH, which made sense. And so some similar figures just measured the phosphorus and calcium in our soil. So this biochar had a lot of phosphorus and calcium, and where we saw the higher dose, we saw much more concentration of phosphorus and calcium than our 1% mixes, which were all acted about the same, and they were all doing better than a control or pre-experiment soil. So something to consider, people think of biochar as mostly carbon, but depending on where it comes from, it can also have a variable nutrient concentration. And that's something to consider if you're also going to be fertilizing your soil or your trees, just to account for. So one thing that folks have wondered about, we've wondered about, was, do we need to apply biochar again? How long does it last in the field? And so we did some scanning electron microscopy analysis of the biochar. So we took some fresh biochar and analyzed those. And then after it had been out in the pots with the trees for the summer, we went and collected some more pieces and analyzed those. So these are the images. The fresh biochar hasn't been anywhere. Just made it and we put it in the lab and analyzed it. So you get these images and you can see these nice pore structures, what we call them. These are actually the remnants of cell walls that you can see. Here's like a zoomed in version, the nice and smooth, orderly structure. And we often hypothesize that these pores are where chemistry can happen and where soil can be incorporated into the biochar, where water can be stored and help maintain a higher soil water concentration. And so on the field biochar, this is after 6 months of being in our pots. You can see that there's some breakdown of the actual structure of the pores, so they're a little bit less organized and they look physically dirty. And this is the incorporation of soil particles into these pore structures. And as a part of this analysis, we do elemental detection surveys, and these are basically we shoot the laser at individual points on the charcoal and measure the elemental composition of each point. And so this is just an example, not a totally representative number for each piece of biochar, but for these that we were looking at, our fresh biochar was like 88% carbon, and oxygen was like most of it, which if you look at the molecular structure of charcoal, it should be mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and this technique isn't really sensitive to hydrogen. But there's also a little bit of calcium and silica, which is present in natural tissues. But then once it's been in the field, there is this one incorporation of actual soil particles into it. So the percent of carbon in what we can extract as biochar is lower, but also the material is like decomposing over time. So you're losing carbon that way. So there's more oxygen, which we find with ongoing decomposition. Sometimes there's incorporation of oxygen. And then this much higher percentage of silica, which is reflective of the soil particles being incorporated into the biochar. Lots of soil minerals are highly silica based, so that made sense. But it was pretty cool to see this actually bear out in the field. So the implication of this being that like you may at some point need to apply biochar again to a soil with the way you first apply it. So the biochar increased our tree vault water retention, particularly when we amended it at the highest dose, which was 5%. I think you could go higher than that if you wanted to. And then when added at the top, and active mulch. So this is good if you have a tree vault or a tree in a soil where it's water stress, it's too little water. And a biochar increased the outflow water pH, at least initially. And this would be good if it also increased the soil pH. So if you have a low acidic pH, this could be a good solution as a liming effect, which is a pretty common soil solution, except in some urban soils. So it's just worthwhile to check your soil pH. The biochar that we applied did contribute some salts to the outflow water quality, but this declined over time and wasn't really of concern, just something to note. And it did overall improve tree growth under stress responses. So the trees really seem to enjoy having a bit of biochar to help them with their water status. So with our following study that I don't have time to talk about, but we're looking at how we can add biochar to already growing trees. Is there much of effect if the tree is already existing? And how to figure out how much exactly to apply to these already growing trees. So I'm going to leave you all there and let Holly Campbell take over for some management recommendations.
Okay, hello everyone. I wanted to share with you some of the practical applications that we wanted to share with all of you as an audience, but also some readers. So Dr. Abney had mentioned that we just published a fact sheet, and so we provided these practical management applications, and so I'm going to go through some of the steps. And specifically, I want to go through what we called our decision support tool, and so we have a series of steps that we recommend people follow in sequential order. So I'm going to start with the first step, and if you wanted to look at this publication, maybe Dr. Abney could put the link in the chat box. So if anyone wants to link to that, download it. But I'm going to sort of follow along this decision support tool that we created. So I'm going to start with step one. Okay, so as Dr. Abney reviewed, biochar has a number of effects in the soil. And some of those effects are increasing soil fertility. So that could reduce the need for fertilizers because you have an increased CEC or cation exchange capacity. It can also sort of modify the liming effects to improve soil, like Dr. Abney was saying, especially in southern soils, southeastern U.S. soils, can help raise the pH a little bit and make a little more nutrients available. So biochar also, we didn't mention as much, but has a potential to reduce contaminant availability in the soil, which can be supportive of trees in urban settings. So for example, helping bind heavy metals, salts, and making them less available to the tree. So also improving soil hydrologic properties like soil drainage and water retention, increasing soil carbon sequestration, improving soil structure, and also improving soil microbial habitat. So there's a number of benefits, and it's really important first, and always starting, what are your objectives? What are the objectives for managing the soil around the urban trees that you're managing, either planting or existing trees that you're managing? And so thinking critically about what your site goals are and your soil goals are in that, and how they overlap with what biochar can provide. Next slide, please. Okay, so step 2 is evaluating your site. And so really understanding the existing site's soil physical and chemical properties to determine if biochar, so this is kind of another layer of information in addition to your goals, determining if biochar is going to help you meet those management goals. So we recommend that you look at your soil drainage. So that also involves looking at the soil texture. So if the site has a coarse soil, so a sandy soil, that typically is associated with rapid infiltration, biochar can help increase water retention and decrease the drainage rate in these soils, so it can provide that benefit. Fine soils, like our more clay-dominant or silt-dominant soils that may be more associated with poor structure or slower infiltration, biochar can improve the soil structure and create more macropores that can increase the drainage of that soil. So it should be noted, and we put this in the publication, that biochar, if there's a site that needs rapid drainage, so for example, a golf course, that you're managing the trees around that golf course turf, that biochar can slow that drainage down. And so it's just good to be mindful of that. So the next recommendation that we make in evaluating the site is taking a soil test. So in Georgia, the State Cooperative Extension Service is a great place that a lot of people send their soil samples to the soil testing lab here. So take a sample from each of the sites that you'll be managing the trees that you're interested in applying biochar. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest aggregating those soil samples together. So make it individual samples. And you want to, when you drop off your sample, select for macro and micronutrients. So for example, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, manganese, and so on. Also looking at the CEC and the organic matter in your soil. You also want to indicate which species of tree that you're managing. If there's a notation for that, either conifers, deciduous trees in the landscape. Next slide, please. Okay, so after evaluating your site, we recommend going to step 3, which is using the soil chemistry and biochar chart in addition to the decision support tool. And so you're going to look at your soil values that you got from the soil testing lab, and you're going to compare those with the values that are on the table, which provides sort of a range of values that support biochar suitability. So if your results are mostly in the green category, then biochar is typically going to be a good candidate for your soil. If your results for your soil are in the intermediate chart or the intermediate column, there may be some pros or cons to using biochar on your site. And if your soil results, pH, CEC, etc., are in the red column, you may want to be very careful in considering using biochar on the site, particularly in regard to pH. And so there's a notation here with the pH above, if your soil pH is above 7, you can still use biochar, but you may want to get biochar that has added elemental sulfur in it to keep the pH lower, to help support lower pH. So you can add that as an amendment, but also you can use a biochar that has a lower pH in those higher or more alkaline soils. Next slide, please. All right, so step 4 is looking at selecting a biochar. So Dr. Abney reviewed a little bit about this earlier, but again, biochars have different effects in the soil. If you want to select the best biochar for your site to meet your management objectives, I recommend looking at the biochar manufacturer's label, which is going to provide information about how it was made, what may have been added to it, such as sulfur or fertilizer, and just getting more information about some of the details and some of the chemical composition of the biochar. So if that information is not available, you can also have your biochar tested at the soil test lab. You can test for something called lime equivalency, which is the biochar's acid neutralizing capacity in the soil. Then the lab can test for all of the micronutrients that you tested your soil for, as well as organic matter, percent moisture. You could also consider testing the C to N ratio, so the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Since the C to N ratio that is sort of greater than 30 all the way up to 100 plus to 1. So that would be carbon and nitrogen 30 to 100 or more to 1. Can also serve as a nitrogen sink. So that's something to consider. Okay, so biochar feedstocks. So this is what the biochar is made from. So biochar made from woody materials, for example, pine, hardwoods. Dr. Abney mentioned almond hulls, pistachio shells. These can help increase organic matter. And so this can lend to greater carbon storage, potentially carbon sequestration in the soil. There's also biochar made from leafy and or herbaceous materials like grasses, corn stalks, other agricultural waste that can help enhance soil fertility. There's also biochar made from animal manures that can help serve as a fertilizer. So there are also some amendments that are sometimes added to biochar. So there's biochar with added fertilizer and compost, which can help support soil fertility. And in fact, we recommend that especially nutrient poor woody biochar should rarely be applied on its own and should be accompanied by fertilizer or compost. Biochar with added mycorrhizae is another option, which may improve tree growth and health. And you want to think about your species though in this, because not all trees associate with mycorrhizae. And again, mycorrhizae is a symbiotic relationship with a fungi and a tree or a plant species that can help facilitate a lot of benefits for both organisms. So especially for the tree, increasing water and nutrient uptake and helped with drought stress. So mycorrhizae are great and aren't always as maybe abundant in new urban tree planting settings. But we have a nice chart here on the right side of the slide that talks about different types of trees that are associated with certain mycorrhizae. So you would want to make sure that your biochar had the type of mycorrhizae added to it that would be associated with the species that you're planting. So biochar also can have added lime, which will increase the soil pH. That isn't always, as we saw with some of the figures, biochar typically will have a higher pH. So I guess that depends on the pH of the biochar. So you want to refer back to the lime equivalents of the biochar on this. And then also there's biochar with added sulfur. Of course, elemental sulfur helps lower the pH of soils. So that could help sort of ameliorate that effect of a high pH in a biochar. So as Dr. Abney mentioned, biochar can be purchased at most home improvement stores, garden stores. It can even be purchased online. Also, there's some local companies that may be making biochar. It could be a byproduct. It could be intentionally making biochar, but typically with a byproduct, especially with forestry operations, it's possible to obtain the biochar from that manufacturer or producer, and this could lower the cost of the shipping and purchasing, especially a large quantity of biochar. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about applying biochar, and this is specifically to newly planted trees. So the first step is you want to approximate the volume of soil where your new tree will be growing the first several years. So I have an example to the right here. I'm not recommending that that's a good volume to plant maybe even this size tree in, but I'm just going to use this to illustrate as an example. So we have a 5 feet by 5 feet by 1 foot deep planting area, 25 cubic feet. So you're going to approximate that volume. So, and then it's recommended to calculate as far as the amount of biochar to add. I've heard everything from 2.5 up to 10% of biochar per the planting volume. So again, you're looking at your volume in our example, 25 cubic feet. and you want to add 5 to 2% of the volume, 10% of the volume of biochar. And so I did a little calculation here. So 5% of the volume is 1.25 cubic feet of biochar, which is about a little over 9 gallons. If you want to think about an easy container to apply it with, 10% would be 2.5 cubic feet of biochar. And before it's applied, it needs to be moistened, not drenched, but just moistened. And that's so it doesn't blow away as it's being applied, is one aspect of that. And then with new tree planting, incorporating this biochar in throughout the soil profile, but at least in the top 10 inches of the soil at planting. So as you're filling in with the backfill of the soil, mixing the biochar into it. And then to keep the biochar and to from blowing away, protect the soil surface, add 2 to 4 inches of good quality mulch over the soil. Next slide, please. Okay, so we also wanted to address applying biochar to existing trees of various ages. So it's kind of going through the same steps that we had on the last slide. You're going to be even greater trying to approximate the tree planting soil volume. In our part of the country, most trees are in about the top 3 feet of soil. And gosh, depending on the planting area, the roots, I mean, if we're not talking about a planting vault and we're in a larger planting area, the roots can have quite a spread out from the tree, but typically the top 3 feet of soil. So sort of estimating a volume, calculating the percentage of biochar per that volume, and incorporating the moistened biochar into the top 6 inches of soil using an air spade, ideally. This typically is a service that can be hired out by a certified arborist, and then some organizations may have access to an air spade like we have at the University of Georgia here. So in using an air spade, though, and incorporating the soil, it's often recommended to incorporate compost in at the same time. You want to make sure that your soil is at field capacity and ideally during the dormant season to reduce root damage, especially fine root damage. And then adding mulch over the area that's been worked on. Next slide, please. Okay, so reapplying biochar. And I also wanted to address storing biochar if you purchase a large quantity of it. Okay, so you're going to revisit some steps, reassessing your management goals, but you want to return especially to steps 2 and 3. So taking a soil test, evaluating that soil test, seeing how it fits with that decision support tool, looking at soil chemistry, and you want to ensure that your application of biochar hasn't excessively elevated nutrient levels or increased your soil pH outside of sort of a safe zone for nutrient availability. And so you're just kind of reassessing, like, what is the next step that you want to take? And so after you make that reassessment, if you decide that, yes, I can proceed with this, it's not going to, again, put my soil chemistry sort of in a unhealthy zone for my tree species or your tree species, then you can proceed to step 4 to select your best biochar. Maybe you want to experiment with a different type of biochar that has different qualities to it. And then applying the biochar either to an existing site, maybe you're planting additional trees in a site that you planted the year prior, or you are working around more existing trees that have been in the ground for some time. So storing biochar. So biochar can be stored dry for a very long time, decades to centuries. But if it's wet, it's going to start to decompose and break down. And so ensuring that you have it nice and dry before you put it away for storage is essential. Next slide, please. Okay, that's all I had. I think we have plenty of time for questions too.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Holly, for that. I feel like we got some really awesome questions in the chat.
We do. Thank you all. That's fantastic presentation. Great piece of research, I think. Very applied. Thank you all for doing that research and for sharing it and really giving us some recommendations based on the research at the end. It was great. We do have a number of questions. I saw 2 or 3. I'll start off with this one. I saw 2 or 3 questions asking about the use of a liquid biochar versus, the products that we're all using. What your thoughts were on some of the liquid biochars. One of the questions kind of noted, it seems to have a lower price point as an advantage.
I guess I didn't see that question. I'm not sure I've even heard of liquid biochar. But I did see, I guess I'm gonna answer a different question. I did see folks that, like, I guess like compared to like other soil amendments, like the biochar, it's sort of like different like goals for what you have and what you might get out of it. So like with compost, you're probably gonna get more like fertility fertility effects. There tends to be more available nutrients in compost. So people like actually there's been a couple of studies people have applied biochar and compost together and gotten much better effects than just biochar alone. Oh, liquid biochar is when you suspend a fine powder into a water solution. Okay, I think it's just easier to apply then. The problem with biochar and ash is they're very dusty and they're very susceptible to wind and water erosion. So if you don't apply them and either mix them in well or put them under mulch, you might lose quite a bit of it. Just the first rainstorm that happens or the first windy day. But biochar that like is mixed with it often is mixed with other components, so you kind of have to pick like which biochar you want to address your particular soil issues. So that's why we recommended doing a soil test first, so you know what like potential issues you're trying to fix before just applying biochar, because it's definitely not the perfect amendment for all soils.
And Rebecca, related to that, there was a question about, the source of your biochar, and I guess being careful that there's not other materials maybe incorporated into it that might be toxic or cause some other soil issues, maybe heavy metals or something else. Any thoughts on sourcing your biochar?
Yeah. If you know it's just made from plant material, then it's pretty safe. Like you can burn wood or almond hulls that haven't been applied with like pesticides, and so forestry products tend to be safer because they don't tend to have like pesticides applied like directly on them. They don't tend to be exposed to heavy metals the way like urban environments might be. Like if you had urban wood, you might have a different concern. Um, and like some agricultural materials do have pesticides and herbicides applied to them, and those can be like just something to be aware of. But generally, that's like not of concern in the biochar itself. Like depending on the temperature it reaches, a lot of those will burn off. So it tends to be pretty safe itself. Now, on the flip side, people are using biochar to take up contaminants. So it's been used as like remediation. So it does take up heavy metals. There's been a lot of research on that, like cadmium, lead, and so on. And then like we're starting to do some research here at UGA about like the uptake of nutrients as contaminants, and it seems to be very mixed. There are some like more high-end biochars that are treated with like magnesium chloride, or other like salt treatments that will take up nutrients, but those tend to be pretty pricey. So it's not really, as it comes, that great at doing that.
There was a question, it was actually the first question there that says, in one of the photos, there was a dark layer with biochar over the top of native soil. Is there issues with perched water at that interface, poor percolation at that layer? Did y'all see any of that in your study?
We didn't, but that is not in this study, but in like the second round study, which we didn't have time to talk about, we did see some issues with too much water retention with the biochar. So if you're in a soil that is already prone to waterlogging, I mean, in general, adding organic matter won't help. Biochar being really higher carbon organic matter, it's really going to hold on to water. So if it probably won't improve your soil if you have too much water. Must be a place I wouldn't recommend using it.
And y'all, Holly or any of y'all see questions you want to ask, if not, I'll just kind of keep running through the list. There was a question here about, the advantages of biochar versus, unburned wood chips, incorporating, mulch organic matter into the soil as opposed to the biochar product. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
Well, we generally would not ever recommend adding like sawdust into soil as an amendment. It has a really high like carbon to nitrogen ratio, and it can actually immobilize nitrogen. So like it's definitely better than that. But as like a mulch, yeah, you can add like wood chips as a mulch. I don't recommend adding wood chips in as a soil amendment either, because that can mess with your drainage. And biochar tends, particularly as you buy it, it's a pretty uniform product and pretty small particle size. So it doesn't tend to have the negative like drainage effects that like larger pieces would have.
Now I'm looking through. I think we have time for probably one more question. We're at 12:58. We have so many questions. Thank you all for all the wonderful questions. And sorry we can't get to them all. Let's see here. Did y'all do any kind of a inoculation? There's a lot of questions here about using other products along with biochars, whether it's mycorrhizae or inoculating. Is that something y'all are looking at with further study, kind of combining some of these products?
Yeah, we definitely would like to do another round with that. There's sort of only so many questions you can answer at once, unfortunately. But yeah, about 100 trees was a good number to start with. But yeah, we definitely would like to do that going forward for sure. And there are companies that sell those too, like the biochar with inoculants.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings us to the conclusion. I want to thank you all very much for a wonderful presentation, for taking the time to share your research on the Tree Fund webinar series. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us. We had, almost 1,200 people on today. That is fantastic way to close out the 2024 year. Be aware that just as a reminder with those CEUs, when you registered, you put your CEU number. We will send that on your behalf directly to ISA. Give them a few weeks to process. This is a lot of people that are going to be sending in CEUs. If you need certificates of attendance, send Heath Hupke a note and he will be able to produce those. I know several of y'all need that. And we will be back next year with another wonderful set of webinars. We have, as Heath mentioned, we might have one sooner, but the next one we have already put up is March 11th. We're going to have our next Tree Fund webinar series. So thank you all. Happy holidays to everybody out there. I hope everyone has a great holiday season. And thank you for taking the time to join. And for those of you that donated to us during this session, thank you very much for those donations. Just as a reminder, those donations go to support research like you heard today that hopefully continue to help us advance the field of arboriculture and urban forestry. So thank you, Dr. Abney. Thank you, Holly, for joining us today. And thank you, David and Paul Putnam. And of course, always my partner in crime, Heath Hupke, who helps make this webinar series happen every month. Cheers all.